It was 9 o'clock on the coldest night of that winter, 30 miles off the Pomeranian coast, and the great ship was running with her lights burning against the dark. She had been built to carry 1,500 holidaymakers on sunlit cruises to Madeira. But that night, she held perhaps 10,000 souls fleeing a collapsing Reich, and near half of them were children. 3 torpedoes crossed the black water and struck her along the port side. The first sealed her own crew behind watertight doors. The second burst into the drained swimming pool where hundreds of young women slept. In under an hour, the freezing Baltic closed over more people than any ship in history has ever taken down. So why is the deadliest sinking the sea has ever known a name that almost no one can place? If the great ships and the disasters that swallowed them pull at you, subscribe and stay to the end, because the reason so many died that night is not the one most people would guess. She was meant to be the happiest ship in the world, a floating promise that Germany had abolished the difference between rich and poor. In the years before the war, the men who ruled Germany understood something about the sea that the old shipping lines had forgotten. A great ship was not only a way across the water. It was a story a nation told about itself, a boast made of steel that could be sailed into any harbour in the world. And the story they wanted to tell was that under their new order, the worker and the clerk and the shopgirl could now enjoy what had once belonged to the wealthy alone. So they built a ship to prove it, and they gave her the name of a man most of the world had never heard of, and they sent her out to be admired. They called her the Wilhelm Gustloff. She belonged to a scheme with a name that sounds, in translation, almost gentle. Strength through joy. It was the leisure arm of the state, the branch that handed out cheap holidays and concert tickets and organized cruises for loyal workers. And it existed for one reason above all others, to bind ordinary Germans to the regime with gratitude and pleasure. The Gustloff was its flagship, the first ship built new for the purpose from the keel up, and she was to be the jewel of the whole idea. She was to sail ordinary people down to the sunshine of Madeira and up into the cold blue beauty of the Norwegian fjords, and she was to do it without a first class, a second class, or a third. There were no locked gates between the decks, no marble suites for the rich and cramped steerage for the poor below. The same cabins, the same dining rooms, the same open decks for everyone aboard. In the propaganda of the day, she carried a nickname that held the whole idea in 3 words: the ship without classes. Hold that phrase in your mind, because the sea would one day make it true in a way no one aboard could have imagined. For now, it was only a boast, and a clever one. She measured a little over 200 meters from her bow to her stern, near enough 684 feet, and she weighed some 25,000 tons. 4 great diesel engines drove her, and she could make around 15 knots, an unhurried pace for a ship whose whole purpose was to be looked at rather than to race. She was not the largest ship afloat, nor the fastest, and she was never meant to be. Her power was of a different kind. She was a moving advertisement, a piece of theatre with a hull, sent out to be photographed and admired, to show the world a warmer and more acceptable face of a regime that was already building something monstrous behind the scenery. To grasp what she meant, you have to grasp the size of the machine standing behind her. Strength through joy was not a small perk handed to a lucky few. In the years before the war, it reached many millions of ordinary Germans, with its cheap theatre seats and its organized hikes and its subsidized holidays, and its cruises were the crown of the whole enterprise, the shining proof that the regime cared for the common man. The Gustloff was the first ship built new to carry that promise out onto the water, and she was meant to be seen and photographed in every harbour she entered, a floating advertisement steaming from port to port. She ran down to the warm islands of the Atlantic and up along the black cliffs of Norway. And everywhere she went, she was meant to say the same thing, that the new Germany had opened the sea and the good life to everyone at last. Inside, she was bright and modern and pleased with herself. There were wide, sunlit promenade decks and a great dining hall that could seat a small town, a theatre, a music room where a band played through the evenings, reading rooms, lounges panelled in pale wood, and low in her hull, glassed and tiled and lit from beneath the water, there was a swimming pool, a small blue jewel of a thing, the sort of luxury that had until then belonged only to the richest liners in the world. To an ordinary German family stepping aboard for the first time, that pool was the proof of the promise made flesh. Here was the good life, the life of the wealthy, opened at last to a factory hand and his wife. Remember the pool. It is the loveliest thing on the ship, and before this story ends, it will become the most terrible. Consider what she did in the brief, bright life she was given. Between the spring of 1938 and the last summer of peace, she carried something over 80,000 passengers on around 60 voyages. 80,000 ordinary people, in barely more than a year, brought home tanned and grateful, carrying photographs of themselves at her rail. They told their neighbours that the new Germany had handed them a gift no one in their family had ever known. A week of sunshine and dignity on a ship where no one was made to feel poor. She did exactly what she had been built to do. She made people believe. And that, in the end, is the cruelty coiled at the centre of her story. Because a ship built to sell a beautiful lie would one day carry the human wreckage of that lie to the bottom of the Baltic, packed to bursting with the very people in whose name she had been launched. But before any of that could happen, there was the small matter of her name, and the dead man it belonged to. The keel, meant to carry Hitler's own name, was renamed for a corpse, a Nazi functionary shot dead in a Swiss stairwell. When the ship was first ordered, the plan had been to christen her Adolf Hitler, the grandest name the regime could bestow, stamped on its grandest holiday ship, a floating monument to the leader himself. But history, as it so often did around this particular vessel, arrived early and rearranged the story. In the winter of 1936, a man named Wilhelm Gustloff, the leader of the Nazi Party's branch in Switzerland, was shot and killed in the mountain town of Davos by a young Jewish medical student named David Frankfurter, who had decided to strike at the movement that was already menacing his people. The regime seized the death at once and made a martyr of the dead functionary, and when the time came to launch the new ship, Hitler, seated at the memorial service beside Gustloff's grieving widow, decided the vessel would carry the murdered man's name instead of his own. There is a bitter symmetry in it worth pausing on, because it shadows everything that follows. The deadliest ship in the history of the sea was named for an act of political murder, ordered into the world by a state that would go on to commit murder on a scale humanity had never witnessed. And she would end her own life, killing thousands of ordinary people, most of them women and children, in a single freezing hour. The name was a small, dark omen, though no one standing at the launch could have read it. She slid down the ways at the great Blom and Voss yard in Hamburg in the spring of 1937, cheered by an enormous crowd, with the dead man's widow and the leader of Germany both looking on from the platform. She had cost around 25 million of the old German marks to build, a genuine fortune, and it had been drawn in the end from the dues and the seized savings of the very working people she was meant to reward. For the regime had crushed the free trade unions and swept their money into its own schemes. She was finished and handed over in the early spring of 1938 after her trials in the North Sea, and she took up at once her place as the flagship of the whole holiday fleet. From that first season until the last summer of peace, she was the pride of the programme, the ship the posters showed, the vessel every rival line watched with envy. Every voyage was a small piece of theatre, the workers lining her rails, the band playing on the sunlit deck, the photographs carried home to show the neighbours. She was a beautiful thing put to an ugly purpose, and for a year and a half she performed that purpose without a flaw, and not one of the ordinary people crowding her decks had any reason to picture the grey and frozen night that waited for her at the end of the line. For a little over a year, she lived the bright public life she had been designed for, and it was a life at least as political as it was pleasant. She sailed on errands of persuasion as much as leisure. In her first weeks, she carried Austrians on cruises meant to soften them toward union with Germany in the days before that union was forced through. She anchored once in the River Thames, off Tilbury, and became a floating polling station, so that Germans and Austrians living in Britain could come aboard and cast their votes in a rigged plebiscite. Nearly 2,000 of them ferried out to her in a single day. She was always half a holiday ship and half an instrument of the state, and she wore both roles with the same gleaming, untroubled ease. To the people who sailed on her, she was simply a marvel. To the men who had built her, she was a tool that happened to be beautiful. And once, only once, she showed the world what she could be at her very best, in a moment that the rest of this story will turn upon like a knife. In the spring of 1938, on an early voyage in the North Sea, she picked up a distress call from a small British coal freighter named the Pegaway, foundering in a savage storm with her cargo shifting and the sea coming aboard and her steering gone. The Gustloff turned for her at once and stood by in the heavy weather, and though the seas were high and the work was dangerous, she put her own boats down into the waves. It took 2 attempts, and one of her boats was very nearly lost, but in the end, her crew took off every single one of the 19 men aboard the sinking freighter. Not one life was lost. It is a small story, and it belongs at the heart of this larger one, because the ship that lowered her boats into a raging sea to save 19 strangers would one day be unable to launch those same boats for her own people. On a night far colder and, in its way, far calmer, the Wilhelm Gustloff would find her lifeboats frozen fast to her sides while thousands drowned in the water beneath them. But that night was still 7 years and 1 world war away. First, the joy had to be stripped out of her. When the war came, they stripped the paint from her hull and the joy from her purpose, and she went still for 4 long years. In the autumn of 1939, as Germany fell upon Poland and the continent tipped over the edge into war, the state reached out and took its holiday fleet back for harder work. The cruises ended overnight. The band stopped playing. The families with their cameras went home and did not return. The Wilhelm Gustloff was requisitioned by the Navy, and the ship that had been built to sell contentment was made ready for the business of killing weather and killing seas. At first, they made a hospital ship of her, and there is a grim irony in even that. They gave her the plain designation of a naval medical vessel, a bare letter and a number where her proud name had been, and they painted her white with a broad green stripe and the red cross that under the laws of war was meant to keep her safe from attack. For a little over a year, she served that quiet purpose, taking in the wounded of the early campaigns, a floating ward drifting between the fighting and the shore. Then, late in 1940, they took even that role from her. The medical equipment was carried off, the white and green were painted over, and she was coated in the flat, featureless grey of a warship. From that moment, she was protected by nothing at all. She was a naval vessel, plain and simple, and any enemy who found her could sink her within the rules. There had been one last flourish before the long sleep closed over her, a final errand from her proud days as a ship of the fleet. In the summer before the war, she was sent south to help bring home the German airmen of the Condor Legion from Spain, where they had fought for Franco and rehearsed, on Spanish towns, the terror bombing that the world would soon come to know for itself. It was a fitting last commission for her, a holiday ship carrying warriors back from a rehearsal for the greater war that was almost upon them. Then that war arrived in earnest, and the errands stopped, and she was tied to her quay and made still, and the world moved on around her and slowly forgot that she was there at all. And then, having been a pleasure ship and a hospital ship, she became something stranger and more still. They moored her in the occupied Polish port of Gdynia, which the Germans had renamed Gotenhafen, and there they turned her into a barracks, a floating dormitory tied to the quay. For more than 4 years, she sat at her moorings without moving, a great grey hotel for around 1,000 young men training for the submarine service, the very crews who would go out into the Atlantic to sink Allied ships. Her engines went cold. Her decks were walked by trainees in their exercises. There is even a strange footnote from those years that when the Germans made a film about the sinking of the Titanic, they filmed some of it in that same harbour, and the submarine trainees from ships like the Gustloff were used as extras, playing the doomed passengers of another great liner. She sat in her long, enforced sleep, while, a few miles inland and across a whole continent, the war ground on and the map of Europe was redrawn in blood. One change made to her in those idle years mattered more than all the rest, and it is the loaded gun that this story places on the table early. To defend her against aircraft, the Navy bolted weapons to her decks, several anti-aircraft guns, ugly grey barrels pointing up at the sky. It was a sensible thing to do to a naval vessel in wartime, and it seemed to cost nothing. But it carried a consequence that would not become clear until her final hour. A ship that carried guns and soldiers, a ship painted warship grey with no red cross and no protected marking, was not a hospital ship and could claim none of a hospital ship's safety under the law. In the cold arithmetic of war at sea, she had quietly become a legitimate target, a warship in all but name. She had been disarmed of her one real protection by the very guns that were meant to protect her, and no one aboard would think of it again until it was far too late. So she waited out most of the war in her grey sleep, all but forgotten, a relic of a happier lie dressed for battle and given nothing much to do. Her old passengers, if they thought of her at all, remembered a warm blue pool and a band in the evening light. But the war that had put her to sleep was about to come looking for her, and it would come from the east, in the depths of the worst winter of the whole conflict. And when it woke her, it would ask her to carry not 1,000 men, but 10 times that number, into the one narrow stretch of sea where a hunter was waiting in the dark. The order that roused her came in the last January of the war, and it came because the entire eastern edge of the Reich was coming apart at once. In January of 1945, the eastern sky glowed with the fires of the Red Army, and 2 million Germans ran for the sea. For 3 long years, the war in the east had been grinding in one direction, driving the German armies back out of Russia, back out of the lands they had ravaged and burned, and now the front had reached the old borders of Germany itself, and it did not stop there. Into the province of East Prussia, the far eastern corner of the country, the Soviet armies poured in the dead heart of winter, and ahead of them fled a tide of human beings such as Europe had rarely seen in all its long history of flight. They came on foot and in farm carts and on the last few frozen trains. Whole towns emptied at once, old men and grandmothers and children, moving west across a white and pitiless landscape under a sky that held enemy aircraft. The temperatures fell far below freezing and stayed there. Children died in the carts along the way and were left beside the road because the ground was too hard and the hour too desperate to dig a grave. Columns of refugees strung out for miles were overtaken in the open by tanks and strafed from the air, and were cut to pieces where they stood. Stories came west with the survivors of villages overrun and of terror behind them, and whether every story was true or not, the fear they carried was real enough to drive people out onto the ice with nothing. It was a catastrophe of the regime's own making. The war, it had started coming home at last, and the ordinary people caught in it paid a price that most of the men who had begun the war would contrive to escape. The man who set the great evacuation in motion was Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, the head of the German Navy, who understood that only ships could save the trapped population of the East, and who ordered his fleet to begin lifting them out across the Baltic. It was, in its cold way, one of the few humane acts of a regime that had shown the world little enough humanity, though it came late and in desperation, and would save only a fraction of those who needed saving. The Navy had only so many ships. The ports held only so many hours before the front reached them. Every vessel that sailed was a gamble thrown against time and ice and the enemy. And into that gamble the Wilhelm Gustloff was now thrown, an old holiday liner asked to do the work of a rescue fleet. Their only road out, that was not truly a road at all, was the sea. If they could only reach the Baltic ports, so the word ran through the frozen columns, ships would carry them west to safety, away from the army at their backs. And so they made for the coast, for the harbours of Pillau and Gotenhafen and Danzig, tens of thousands of them, then hundreds of thousands, all converging on the water with whatever they could still carry in their arms. By the middle of January, the port of Pillau alone held something like 100,000 desperate people, waiting in the open cold for a way across, while the officials who were supposed to be saving them argued among themselves. The local party boss wanted his own favoured families lifted out first, and the evacuation delayed so as not to look like panic. The Navy wanted the ships loaded and gone before the ice and the enemy closed the door. While they argued, the refugees kept pouring in. To lift this human flood, the German Navy launched the largest evacuation by sea in the history of the world. It was given a code name out of the ancient wars, Operation Hannibal, and across the last desperate months of the conflict, it would carry something close to 2 million soldiers and civilians west across the Baltic, out of the path of the advancing Soviets. 2 million people, moved by sea, under fire, in winter. It is a staggering figure, and it is almost entirely unremembered today, because history recalls an evacuation not by its scale, but by its worst night. And the worst night of Operation Hannibal would prove to be the worst night in all the long annals of the sea. Every vessel that could float and steam was pressed into the work, warships and freighters and liners alike. And among them, roused at last from her long grey sleep at her Gotenhafen quay, was the Wilhelm Gustloff. She had not moved under her own power in years. Her engines had to be coaxed back to life by men who half doubted they would run at all. Her hull had to be made ready, her boilers lit, her crew scraped together from whatever hands could be found in a collapsing navy, some of them barely sailors at all. But she was vast, and she could carry thousands, and thousands upon thousands were exactly what stood waiting on the quay. Word spread through the frozen, frightened crowds that the great ship was taking people west, and they began to press toward her in a slow, human tide, clutching papers and children and the small bundles into which a whole life had been folded. The gangways filled, and they kept filling, long past any number the ship had ever been built to hold, because on the quay behind them, the sky in the east was burning, and no one who had fought their way to the ship was willing to be told there was no more room. They came aboard until there was no floor left to stand on, and no one who counted them believed the count. The Wilhelm Gustloff had been designed to carry 1,500 passengers in her cabins, tended by a crew, a comfortable and generous figure for a holiday liner where every guest was to have a bed and a place at a table. On the last full day of January 1945, that number became a bitter and meaningless joke. The refugees poured up her gangways in their thousands, and then in their many thousands, and every space aboard that could hold a human body was filled and then filled again. The cabins took families where they had taken couples, the corridors filled with people sitting shoulder to shoulder, the dining halls, the theatre, the emptied swimming pool, the open decks in the killing cold, all of it packed with human beings. Mothers laid babies in drawers and in the corners of stairwells. Old people were carried aboard and set down wherever a body could fit. And still they came, because the alternative was to remain on the quay and wait for the army. The ship's own records tried to keep pace with the boarding and simply failed. The official lists recorded around 6,000 people, a figure already far beyond anything she had been built for, and every soul aboard knew it was a fiction. Refugees climbed on uncounted, through side doors, in the crush, in the darkness, without papers or names, and no clerk on earth could have tallied them as they came. Even as she made ready to sail, more were still being brought out to her from the shore, several hundred lifted from a smaller steamer and squeezed somehow into a ship that had no room left. The true number aboard will never be known, and that unknowability is itself a part of the horror, for a disaster that cannot even be counted resists being mourned. The best reconstruction, made long afterward by a survivor who gave his life to the question, put the figure at something over 10,500 souls, and of those, by every honest estimate, 4,000 to 5,000 were children. Let the arithmetic land slowly, because it is the whole tragedy carried in a handful of numbers. A ship built to hold 1,500, now bearing more than 10,000. 7 human beings for everyone she had been meant to carry. One vessel, holding the population of a small town, pressed into a steel hull 200 meters long on a freezing winter sea, with only a few dozen lifeboats between all of them and the water. Inside her, the heat of so many crowded bodies grew so heavy that the air turned thick, and against every order many people took off their bulky life jackets simply to breathe and set them aside, and so were parted from the one thing that might have kept them afloat. If anything at all went wrong on that crossing, there was no possible way to save such a multitude. The overcrowding that felt like salvation on the quay was, in cold truth, a death sentence being signed in the dark, name after uncounted name. They were not, all of them, the innocent poor of the propaganda posters, and honesty demands that this be said plainly. Aboard her that night, mixed in among the refugee mothers and the frightened children, were party officials and their families, men of the secret police and of the organization that had built the regime's fortifications with forced labor, functionaries fleeing the reckoning that was coming for them from the east. And there were others too, people swept up from the occupied lands, Lithuanians and Latvians and Poles and Estonians and Croatians, some of them victims of the very regime whose ship now offered them a passage out. The Gustloff held, in her final hours, a cross-section of a collapsing empire, the guilty and the innocent and the merely unlucky, all pressed together in the same corridors, all bound for the same stretch of freezing water. Among the crowd moving through the ship that night was a young man who matters more to this story than he could possibly have known, an assistant to the ship's purser named Heinz Schorn. He was one of the crew, a young German doing an ordinary shipboard job on a night that was anything but ordinary, moving through the human crush with his papers and his duties, and he would live through what was coming when almost everyone around him would not. Keep him in your mind through all that follows, because he is the single thread that carries this story out the far side of the dark. What Schoen witnessed on the night of the 30th of January, he would spend the next 50 years of his life laboring to make the world remember, counting and recounting the dead, arguing over every figure, refusing to let the number sink into silence. But on that evening, he was simply a young crewman on a hopelessly overloaded ship, and the ship was casting off her lines. Not everyone who reached the quay went aboard, and one small story stands for all the choices made in those hours. A family came to the gangway, looked up at the ship, already bulging with people spilling from every rail, and turned away, the father judging her too dangerously crowded to be safe. His instinct saved their lives. His young son grew up to become a well-known actor in America, and to write, decades later, of the ship his father had refused to let them board. For every family who stepped back, thousands stepped on, because stepping on felt like living, and stepping back felt like choosing to die on the ice. At 12:30 in the afternoon, under a low, grey winter sky, the Wilhelm Gustloff let go her lines and moved out from Gottenhafen into the open Baltic, more crowded than any ship has any right to be, and turned her bow toward the west and safety. On her bridge, at that very moment, 4 men were already arguing about how to keep her alive. No ship should sail with 4 masters, and on her last night, the Wilhelm Gustloff carried 4 men who could not agree. This was the first of the fatal flaws, and it was a flaw not of steel or design, but of command, which is often the more dangerous kind. Aboard her that night were 4 separate captains, each with his own authority and his own reading of the danger. There was the ship's own civilian master, an elderly man named Friedrich Petersen, brought back out of retirement to command her, cautious, tired, and out of his depth on a voyage like this one. There were 2 merchant captains taken along almost as senior passengers, and there was a naval officer, a submarine commander named Wilhelm Zahn, who had charge of the military men aboard and who understood the sea they were entering better than any of them. 4 men, 1 ship, and no single clear voice to say what she would do next. In a crisis, divided command is a slow poison, and the poison was already working in her before she cleared the harbour. Petersen himself carried a strange shadow into that command. He was an old man for such work, called back out of retirement, and it was said of him that he had been taken prisoner by the British earlier in the war and released on a kind of understanding that he would not take a ship to sea against them again, so that he commanded now under a cloud, unsure of himself and unwilling to be bold when boldness was what the night demanded. And the ship around him had already been weakened before she ever cleared the coast. She had set out in company with another transport and more than 1 escort, but the other transport and one of the escorting boats had fallen out with mechanical trouble in the biting cold, so that by evening she was left with a single small torpedo boat to guard her, and even that one boat was soon to be half blinded by the freezing weather, a tired captain, a thinning guard, and a darkening sea. The argument that mattered was about how she should cross. Zahn, the submariner, understood better than anyone the danger that lurked in these waters because he had spent his war being that danger himself, hunting from beneath the surface. He argued for exactly the course a submarine captain most fears to face. "Keep her close in to the shore," he urged, "in the shallow water where an enemy submarine cannot easily work or hide. Run her without lights, blacked out and invisible against the dark coast. Push her as fast as her old engines would bear, and steer her in a weaving zigzag so that no torpedo could ever be aimed true." Every instinct he owned trained in the very kind of boat that was surely out there somewhere in the night, told him to hide and to run and to never move in a straight and predictable line. He was overruled. The ship went instead out into deeper water, where the sea was open and a submarine could move and turn with ease. And she went slowly, for she was old and desperately overloaded and could not be pushed hard. And she went in a straight and steady line, because a straight line was simpler for a scratch crew handling a crowded and unfamiliar ship. Each of these choices could be defended on its own, in isolation, by a reasonable and frightened man. Taken together, they laid a table for catastrophe. And then came the last decision, the smallest in the moment and the most terrible in its effect, the one that turned a badly handled crossing into a beacon burning in the night. Word reached the bridge by radio that a convoy of German minesweepers was coming the other way through the same dark water. The immediate fear was of a collision, two blacked-out ships blundering into one another in the blackness and both going down. And so, to prevent that one imaginable accident, Peterson gave the order to switch on the ship's navigation lights, the red and the green running lamps that mark a vessel's position in the dark. For a stretch of that freezing night, on a black and otherwise empty sea, the single most crowded ship afloat announced her exact position to anyone who happened to be watching. A slow smear of coloured light gliding across the water where nothing else showed at all. The convoy she feared never even materialized near her. The lights stayed lit. It is almost unbearable to trace, because every part of it grew out of ordinary human caution rather than any cruelty or malice. A frightened old captain trying to avoid a crash. A ship too full and too tired to run hard or steer clever. A committee of commanders where there should have been one man with one clear head. No single monstrous blunder, only a slow cascade of careful, reasonable, exhausted decisions, each of them nudging her a fraction closer to her death. She had been made easy to find, easy to hit, and far too slow to escape. And out there in the dark, on the very seaward side her officers believed was safe. On the side where no attack was expected at all, something had already caught the glint of her lights and was turning, patiently, to meet her. Beneath the same black water, the hunter had found his ship. Beneath the same black water, a disgraced Soviet captain saw two small lights where no lights had any right to be. His name was Alexander Marinesko, and he commanded a Soviet submarine known simply by the designation S-13. He was a hard-drinking, hard-living officer, brave and reckless in equal measure, and badly out of favour with his own side. In the weeks just before this patrol, he had been in serious trouble, the kind that ends careers, and sometimes ends worse than careers. There had been drink, and an unexplained absence from his post ashore, and talk of an investigation, even of a court-martial that might have seen him disgraced or shot. He had put to sea, in part, as a man with everything to prove and something to outrun, hunting for a success large enough to wash all of it away. On the night of the 30th of January, in the freezing Baltic dark, he found the largest single success in the entire history of naval warfare. He had been prowling those waters for days in foul weather, in a cold so severe that ice built up on the hull of his boat whenever it surfaced. His war was the patient, grinding, unglamorous business of the submarine, long empty hours watching a black horizon, the constant strain of listening, and then, perhaps, a sudden chance. And then, out of that darkness, he was handed the thing no submariner ever truly expects to be given: lights. A great ship, moving slowly across his front, running with her navigation lamps burning, marking herself against the Black Sea as plainly as if she had asked to be seen. Marinesko could scarcely credit his fortune. He turned his boat toward the lights, and he began to stalk. For a submarine captain, it was the chance of a lifetime, and Marinesko understood it in his bones. His war until then had been the ordinary hard grind of the trade. A handful of merchant ships sunk, long empty patrols staring at a black horizon, and the constant knowledge that his own side was watching him and finding him wanting. Now, out of the darkness, a giant had wandered into his path with her lamps burning. Whatever she was huge, and she was the enemy, and she was the one thing on earth that might turn a disgraced officer back into a hero. He did not know her name, and it would not have changed a single thing if he had. He knew only that she was worth every torpedo he carried, and he meant to have her. What followed was a long, patient, nerve-stretched hunt that lasted the better part of 2 hours. The Gustloff had a single escort left to her by then, a small torpedo boat, for the rest of her intended guard had fallen away earlier with mechanical trouble in the bitter cold. And that one remaining escort was half blind, because the same brutal weather had frozen the very equipment it used to detect submarines beneath the surface. So the great ship moved on through the dark, with one deaf guardian at her side, lit up, heavy, slow and straight, while beneath and behind her a submarine crept steadily closer, working into position, hour by hour, entirely unseen. Think of the two vessels through those hours and the gulf that lay between them. On the surface, the great ship, blazing with light, packed with 10,000 souls who believed themselves bound at last for safety, her people warm and crowded in the passages below while the snow fell on her open decks. And beneath and behind her, the long, dark shape of the submarine, cold and cramped and full of men holding their breath, creeping into position with the patience of a predator that knows it will be given only one chance. The ship never saw him coming. Her one seeing eye had frozen shut. Her 4 captains were still arguing on the bridge, and all the while the distance between the hunter and the hunted was closing, yard by yard, through the black water, toward the range at which a torpedo does not miss. Marinesko then made a bold and clever choice, the kind that decides battles and, on this night, would end thousands upon thousands of lives. Rather than attack from the open sea, the direction any defender instinctively watches, he took his boat around toward the coast and lined up his shot from the landward side, the shallow side, the side no one aboard the Gustloff imagined a submarine would ever dare to occupy. The blow would fall from exactly where it was least expected and least feared. He brought S-13 in on the surface, closer than caution should ever have allowed, steadied his aim on the vast, dark bulk of the ship, and had his torpedoes made ready in their tubes. There is a detail told about that moment that has passed into legend, and it should be handed to you as legend, and not as proven fact. It is said that his torpedoes had been painted with dedications, one to the motherland, one to the Soviet people, one to the city of Leningrad that had suffered so terribly under German siege. It makes for a haunting picture, and the certainty of it is thin, so hold it lightly. What is certain is colder and far simpler. A little after 9 o'clock in the evening, some 30 miles off the coast, in a cold that could kill a swimmer in minutes, a disgraced captain looked through his sight at a ship blazing with unexpected light. He knew her only as large and enemy and unmissable. He could not have guessed, and would not learn until long after, that behind her grey steel were pressed more than 10,000 human beings, that near half of them were children, and that most of the rest were women and the old and the wounded. He saw a warship lit up in a war zone, and by every rule he understood, she was his to take. He gave the order to fire. Out into the black water ran the torpedoes, and the deadliest single hour the sea has ever counted began to tick away. At a little after 9, 3 explosions walked down her port side in the space of a few seconds, and the deadliest hour in maritime history began. Marinesko had loosed 4 torpedoes from close range. One of them failed and stuck fast in its tube, and had to be carefully made safe by his own crew before it destroyed the submarine. A small and secret mercy on a night that held almost none. The other 3 ran straight and true across the short black stretch of water and struck the Wilhelm Gustloff along her left side, one after another, walking from her bow back toward her middle. And each of the 3 found a target more dreadful than the one before it, as though the sea itself were aiming. The first torpedo struck her far forward, deep in the bow, and here the ship's own careful design turned against the very people who had trusted their lives to her. She was fitted, as all large ships are, with heavy watertight doors that could seal shut to hold back the flooding sea. A safety feature, a thing meant to save her. The blow forward triggered them, and they slammed closed and locked exactly as they were built to do, sealing off the flooded fore part of the ship from the rest. But behind those doors, in the forward quarters, were many of the ship's own working crew, the sailors who best knew how to swing out and lower the lifeboats and manage a crowd in the dark. In an instant, they were trapped, walled off from the rest of the vessel by the very mechanism designed to protect her, drowning at the bow while 10,000 people who would soon need them desperately waited above in the dark. The ship lost the hands that might have saved her passengers in the first seconds, before the panic had even begun to spread. The second torpedo struck her amidships and low, and it found the swimming pool. Remember the pool, the blue jewel of the holiday ship, the shining proof of the promise. On this last voyage, that drained and tiled compartment deep in her hull had been given over as quarters to several hundred young women of the Naval Auxiliary, girls in uniform far from home who had been sent aboard for the evacuation. The torpedo burst in among them, and the ceramic tiles of the pool became a storm of flying shards, and the freezing sea came roaring in behind. Of the 373 young women quartered in that place, 3 survived. 3. It is a figure to sit with in silence for a moment. The loveliest room on the whole ship became the most complete grave aboard her, and the promise of the good life opened to everyone ended, for those young women, in the dark, beneath the waterline, in the space of a single held breath. The third torpedo struck her engine room, in the very middle of the ship, and it killed her heart. In one blow, the power failed across the entire vessel. Every light went out at once, and the means to send a clear and steady call for help was crippled. More than 10,000 people were plunged in a single instant into total darkness, into a cold that bit at once, with a violent list already beginning to tilt the deck beneath their feet, and a silence broken only by the sound of the sea pouring in far below and the first rising note of human terror beginning to climb through the ship. In the first moments after the 3 blows, there was a kind of terrible hush, the shock that comes before the scream, as 10,000 people in the sudden dark understood together that something final had happened to the ship beneath them. Then the sound came, rising from every deck at once, the cries and the prayers and the pounding of hands on jammed doors, and beneath all of it, the deep groan of the ship herself as the sea forced its way into her wounds. Those nearest the torpedoes were already dead or dying. Those further off began to move, blind in the black corridors, feeling their way along the walls, carrying children, climbing toward a boat deck that tilted a little more with every passing minute. She had been struck for less than a minute, and already she was leaning toward the sea that would take her. Try to hold the same instant from a dozen places at once, the way it truly happened. A mother in a corridor thrown hard against a bulkhead as the deck jumped under her. A child, asleep in a stairwell, woken into roaring blackness. The three young women somewhere in the shattered ruin of the pool who would, against all reason, survive. The trapped sailors at the bow, already gone, and the young purser, Heinz Schön, feeling the three blows shudder up through the hull one after another, and knowing at once, as only a crewman can know, that the ship beneath his feet was already dead. 1 second, more than 10,000 lives, and every single one of them changed forever or ended in the dark. The Wilhelm Gustloff, 30 miles from land, in water 4 degrees above freezing, had just under an hour left to live. And the first hard truth the survivors learned as they clawed their way up through the blackness toward the boat deck was that the boats would not come. The lifeboats that might have saved thousands were locked in ice, and the men who knew how to work them were already drowning at the bow. In the black, listing chaos of the upper decks, people fought and clawed their way toward the lifeboats, because the lifeboats were the one hope that every soul aboard understood by instinct. But the boats did not answer. The same brutal cold that had frozen the escort's instruments and iced the hunting submarine had frozen the great ship herself. Her lifeboats sat in their davits, sheathed in a hard casing of ice, welded fast to the ship by the weather, and they would not swing out no matter how the falls were hauled. Frantic hands and a few desperate tools hacked and beat at the ice in the dark, and boat by boat it went slowly, terribly slowly, while the deck tilted further and further underfoot, and the minutes ran away. Of all the boats she carried, only a small handful were ever successfully got away, perhaps 9 of them. The rest stayed locked to her sides as she died, useless, ornamental, a cruel promise of rescue that could not be kept. And now the loss of the forward crew told its full and bitter price, because the men who best knew the difficult, dangerous work of lowering a fully loaded boat down the side of a rolling ship in darkness were gone, sealed away in the first seconds behind the watertight doors. What was left to do, the work, was a mass of terrified civilians, most of whom had never in their lives laid a hand on a davit, trying to launch heavy wooden boats down the flank of a ship that was steadily capsizing beneath them. Then, around 20 minutes after the torpedoes struck, the ship gave a sudden and violent lurch to port, heeling far over toward the wounded side the torpedoes had opened to the sea. And this one movement turned the few small successes into fresh horrors. Boats that had been swung out on the high starboard side, the side now rising into the air as she rolled, swung inward and crashed back against her steepening flank, spilling the people inside them down the length of the tilting steel and into the black water. Some boats came down on top of people already struggling in the sea. Some jammed in their falls and hung there useless at a drunken angle, while those inside them clung on and screamed. The order and the discipline that any evacuation needs to work, the calm hands and the clear commands, none of it existed here in any measure. There was only a crowd, and a growing slope of iced steel, and the freezing black water rising steadily to meet it. On the stairways and in the narrow passages, the panic did its own killing long before the sea ever reached the people trapped there. In the blind crush to reach the open decks, the fallen were trampled where they lay, and children were torn from the hands that had held them, and the strong climbed over the weak in the animal need to reach the air. Doors jammed shut under the sheer press of bodies. Whole families were parted in seconds in the dark and never found one another again in this life. And there were those who, understanding exactly what waited for them in the water, chose not to face it at all, so that among the sounds of that ship were the sounds of people ending their own families and themselves, rather than let the cold do it slowly. The horror aboard her was not one thing. It was 1,000 separate horrors, each unfolding alone in the dark, all in the same handful of minutes. And still the decks were packed with thousands of people because there had always been far too many. This is the cold heart of the whole disaster, the thing that lifts it out of the ordinary run of shipwrecks and makes it the worst of them all. Even if every single boat had launched clean and full, they could together have carried only a small fraction of the 10,000 aboard. A ship carrying a normal, sensible load might have lost some souls and saved the greater number. The Gustloff, packed to 7 times her capacity, her boats frozen fast, her trained crew sealed away and drowning, her hull rolling over inside half an hour, offered no arithmetic in which most of her people could live. There were many thousands of human beings, and a bare handful of boats, and only a few dozen minutes, and that sum could come out only one way. The list grew and grew, until it passed the point where a person could keep their feet at all. People began to slide, and then to fall, down the length of the canting deck into the freezing sea, or against the rails, or into a terrible tangle of ropes and boats and other falling bodies. Those who still could jumped, choosing the black water over the dying ship. Those who could not clung where they were as the angle steepened toward the vertical, and prayed and waited. And above the whole vast scene, there rose a sound that the survivors would never afterward be able to describe, and never once be able to forget. The sound of many thousands of human voices crying out together at once across the dark and freezing water. Out into that water, into a cold that could kill a grown man in minutes and a child in far less. The people of the Wilhelm Gustloff were going, one after another, beyond any counting. The sea that night was 4 degrees above freezing, and it gave a body only minutes before the cold did the torpedoes' work for them. This is the part of the story from which the imagination flinches, because the true killer of the Wilhelm Gustloff was not the explosion, and it was not the drowning. It was the water itself. The Baltic, in the last night of January, stood at around 4 degrees above freezing, cold enough to numb and stop a strong swimmer's limbs within minutes and a small child's within moments. The air above the water was worse still, 10 and 15 and 18 degrees below freezing, a killing wind across the surface, and here and there floes of ice drifted through the wreckage. Into all of that, from the rolling and shrieking deck, went thousands of people, many of them without the life jackets they had shed in the crowded heat below, and many of the rest wearing jackets that would only do one thing now: hold a frozen body upright long after the life had gone out of it. For most of those who reached the water, death did not arrive in the way they had feared, in a thrashing struggle and a final going under. It came instead as a slow and creeping stillness. The cold took the strength from their arms first, then the feeling from their hands and feet, then the will to fight, and one by one they slipped down into the numb grey quiet that is the last stage of freezing, and were gone. Parents held children who stopped moving in their arms and would not wake. People who had survived the explosions and the fall and the desperate fight to the rail lasted only a little while longer once they were in the sea, and then the Baltic simply switched them off, quietly, in their hundreds and their thousands, scattered across a wide black stretch of water, strewn with wreckage and half-swamped boats and the floating dead. Set the numbers of that water against one another, and the cruelty of it stands plain. The sea held at around 4 degrees above freezing, the air at 10 to 18 degrees below it, and a body in such cold has only minutes of useful life in it, fewer still for the very young and the very old, who made up so much of the ship. More than 10,000 people had sailed. A few dozen boats, most of them frozen fast, had been the whole of their hope. And now, the greater part of them were in the sea together, a vast, scattered field of the freezing and the drowning, spread across the black water for further than any eye could have followed had there been light enough to follow it. Turn now to the clock, because the sheer speed of it is its own particular terror. She had been struck a little after 9 in the evening. Within about 20 minutes, she had taken her violent list to port. In less than 40 minutes from the first torpedo, she was lying right over on her side, her decks gone almost vertical, her lights long dead, her people already in the water or sliding helplessly toward it. And roughly 10 minutes after that, she went down. From the first strike to the last of her sliding beneath the surface was on the order of 50 to 60 minutes. A ship the length of 2 football pitches laid end to end, carrying the entire population of a small town, was gone from the face of the sea in about the time it takes to sit through the evening news. The first rescue ships to reach the scene found something their crews would carry with them for the rest of their lives. Their searchlights swept across a sea carpeted with people, most of them already still, held upright and lifeless in their life jackets. A whole silent crowd of the dead riding the swell as though they were waiting for something. Here and there, a single voice still called across the water, and the boats turned toward the voices. But for every one they reached, 100 were already beyond any reaching. It was less a rescue than a gleaning, a slow and grievous gathering of the few from among the many under the sweeping lights in the killing cold. At the very end, she went down by the bow, the way she had first been struck, her stern lifting slowly toward the black sky before it too slid away into the dark. And here the sea offered one last cruel detail. For a few moments, her masts and her upper works still stood out above the surface, even as her hull settled onto the bottom, because the place where she died was shallower than she herself was long. She lay in a little over 40 meters of water, and she measured more than 200 meters from bow to stern. A ship longer than the depth of the sea that had swallowed her. Then even the masts were gone, drawn under, and where the largest single loss of life in the entire history of the sea had just taken place, there was nothing left at all but the dark and the drifting ice, and the cries thinning out across the water, and the small hurrying lights of a few ships racing toward a rescue that for all but a fraction had already come far too late. Somewhere out in that black water, the young purser Heinz Schön was still, impossibly, alive. And so, more impossibly still, was a baby that no one had yet found. Out of the thousands in the water, the rescue ships found barely more than 1,000, and the very last of them was a single frozen child. The distress had gone out, crippled as the ship's power had been, and through the freezing dark, a scatter of German vessels turned hard toward the place where the Gustloff had died. Torpedo boats, minesweepers, a steamer, small patrol craft, everything within reach of the disaster came racing across the black water to pull people from a sea that was killing them by the minute. They worked through the cold and the dark for hours, hauling survivors up over the side with numb hands, and every single soul they managed to lift from the water was a small victory, won against the clock and against the Baltic. But the water won far, far more than it lost. When the tally was finally made, the rescue ships had pulled about 1,252 people alive from the sea. Set that figure beside the 10,000 and more who had sailed, and the true scale of it becomes almost impossible for the mind to hold. One torpedo boat took aboard more than 500. Another lifted some 470. A minesweeper here took nearly 100. Another there took a few dozen. A steamer took a small handful. A patrol boat took a few more. And so the living were gathered in ones and tens and hundreds, while the dead were counted in their many thousands. 13 of those who were brought aboard, still breathing, died anyway, of cold and shock, before they could ever be landed. In the end, the sea gave back barely one soul in 8 of all the people it had taken. The rescue itself was a race that most of the rescuers lost. The ships that came were small, and the sea was wide and dark and full of the dying, and every minute in that water shortened the odds against the people in it. Crews reached down for hands too frozen to grip back. They pulled aboard men and women who died in their arms on the deck a moment later. They were forced to choose, again and again, which cries to steer toward and which to leave behind, because they could not possibly reach them all, and no seaman ever forgets a choice of that kind. Slowly the boats filled with the living and passed on among the floating dead, and the number that could be saved was fixed by the cold long before the night was over. And then came the last of them. Hours after the ship had gone down, when the rescuers had all but abandoned any hope of finding another living person in that killing water, a small patrol boat came upon a single drifting lifeboat riding low and quiet among the wreckage, and inside it, wrapped and half frozen and somehow still faintly breathing, was a baby. One infant, entirely alone, the very last living thing the Baltic surrendered from the whole vast catastrophe. The petty officer who lifted that child out of the boat is said, in many tellings, to have taken it home and raised it as his own, and whether or not that final grace is exactly true in every detail, the image stands as the truest summary of the night that anyone could ever offer. A ship of more than 10,000, a sea of some 9,000 dead, and the last thing it gave back, long after all hope was gone, was one small child, alone in an open boat in the dark. There is no way to make that ratio into anything other than what it is. Of more than 10,000 people who had crowded up her gangways in hope, about 1,200 lived to see the morning. The rest, some 9,000 of them, 4,000 to 5,000 of them children, remained in the Baltic. It is a loss so large that the mind simply slides off it, and that, perhaps, is part of why the world found it so easy to set the whole thing down. A single death can be grieved. 9,000 at once, in an hour, in the dark, is not a grief the mind can hold, and so there is a temptation to look away from it. And for a very long time, the world did precisely that. Follow the recurring thread through the whole of it. Heinz Schön, the young assistant purser, was among the 1,200 who lived. He came up out of that freezing water and into a Germany that was itself dying, into a war with only weeks of life left in it, and then into a peace that would find no room at all for German grief. He carried the night with him for the rest of his days. But where another man might have spent a lifetime trying to forget, Schön did the opposite, deliberately and against the whole current of his times. He decided that the thing he could not bear was that the world would never know how many had truly died on that ship, and so he made the counting of the dead the work of his life. But the counting would have to wait for its hearing, because in the winter of 1945 there was almost no one left with the will to listen. And because the very same submarine that had killed the Gustloff was, even then, already hunting again in the same dark sea. 11 days later, in the same water, the same submarine sank another crowded ship and drowned 4,500 more. The horror of the Wilhelm Gustloff can feel, told on its own, like a freak of terrible luck, a once-in-a-century convergence of bad weather and bad choices, and a hunter in exactly the wrong place. It was nothing of the kind. It was the worst single night of a whole season of them, and the proof of that came with awful speed. Alexander Marinesko and his submarine S-13 were still out there in the Baltic dark, and 11 days after the Gustloff went down, in the very same evacuation and the very same stretch of hunted sea, he found another loaded German ship, a former liner pressed into the same desperate work of carrying refugees and wounded soldiers to the west. He sank her too. Around 4,500 people died in that second sinking. In 11 days, one submarine and one captain had accounted for well over 13,000 human lives. The second ship he sank was carrying wounded soldiers and refugees much as the Gustloff had, and she went down in the same cold water in much the same way, and any man who had wondered whether the first sinking might have been a freak of luck had his answer inside a fortnight. The same captain, the same submarine, the same hunted sea, and another 4,500 people dead. None of it was luck. The whole winter had taken on this same shape, drawn in the water by too many people, too few ships, and an enemy who missed nothing that showed itself against the dark. And still the pattern did not break. Some weeks later, another crowded evacuation ship, the Goya, was torpedoed on the same route by a different Soviet submarine, and she went down with a loss so nearly total that only about 183 people survived out of some 7,000 who had been aboard her. 3 ships in one single winter, in one small corner of one sea, each of them carrying a death toll that on its own would rank among the very worst in all of maritime history. The Gustloff was the deadliest of the 3, but she did not die alone or unrepeated, and that is the fact that turns her story from a tragic accident into something closer to an indictment of the whole murderous season. It is worth saying plainly what those few weeks amounted to, because the plainness of it is so easily lost among the figures. In the space of roughly 100 days, the evacuation of the East across the Baltic carried close to 2 million people to safety, an achievement without equal in the whole long history of the sea. And in the very same waters, as part of the very same effort, it produced the 3 deadliest ship sinkings ever recorded, one after another, each a slaughter on a scale the world usually reserves for the great battles fought on land. Rescue and catastrophe ran side by side in the same cold sea, carried out by the same navy in the same desperate weeks, and the catastrophe was, in the end, the terrible price of the rescue. Set these numbers against the disasters the world does choose to remember, and the strangeness of the silence only deepens. The Titanic, the great byword for catastrophe at sea, the ship whose name every child on Earth seems to know, took around 1,500 people down with her into the North Atlantic. The Wilhelm Gustloff took at the very least 4 times that number, and by the higher estimates 6 times as many, and she did it in a single hour rather than a long, slow night. The Lusitania, whose sinking helped to turn a whole world toward war and echoed down the following century, lost just under 1,200 souls. The Gustloff lost more than 7 times as many as the Lusitania, and left scarcely a mark upon the world's memory at all. 3 of the deadliest sinkings ever recorded happened within a few freezing weeks of one another in the same waters, and together they took more lives than a dozen of the famous named disasters combined, and the world has folded almost the whole of it quietly away and looked elsewhere. Hold the 3 of them together for a moment, the Gustloff and the Steuben and the Goya, and you are looking at something close to 20,000 human beings lost in one small corner of one sea in the space of a few weeks, most of them fleeing civilians, most of them never written into any list at all. There is no single memorial that holds all of them. There is no anniversary the world keeps for them. 3 great ships, 3 catastrophes each worthy of its own long remembrance, folded together and quietly set aside, because the moment they happened in had no room to mourn them, and the long years that followed had no wish to. Why the sea gave up so many at once in that particular winter is, in truth, no mystery at all. It was the head-on collision of a total evacuation with a total war. Ships were loaded far past any margin of reason, sent out in freezing water in the dead of winter, and hunted by an enemy who possessed both every legal right to sink them and every private reason of his own to try. The mechanism of the slaughter was not strange or hidden. What is strange, and what the last part of this story has to reckon with honestly, is the forgetting that came afterward. And to understand that forgetting, you have to look closely at the two men who stand at the very center of it. The hunter, who was punished rather than praised for the greatest kill in the history of naval war, and the survivor, who refused for 50 years to let the dead go uncounted and unnamed. The man who caused the greatest death at sea in history was not decorated for it. He was disgraced, demoted, and cast out. You might reasonably expect that a submarine captain who had sunk the largest ship of his entire career and struck so staggering a blow against the enemy would have gone home to medals and parades and a hero's welcome. Alexander Marinesko did not. His own old troubles had followed him back to port and were waiting for him there. The heavy drinking and the misconduct that had shadowed him before the patrol were not washed away by his success, and the Soviet authorities, weighing the difficult man against the extraordinary deed, decided in the end that he was not the sort of figure they wished to hold up before the nation as a hero. The highest honor was quietly withheld from him. He was given a lesser decoration instead, then demoted in rank, and before that same year was out, he was pushed out of the Navy altogether, discharged in something very close to disgrace. His later life was a long, slow unraveling. He drifted through a series of ordinary jobs, fell foul of authority more than once, spent a stretch of time imprisoned, and lived out his years far from any of the glory that his one night of terrible success might have brought a luckier or a more disciplined man. Only decades afterward, and near the very end of the Soviet Union itself, was he at last formally rehabilitated, and in 1990, long after he was dead, he was finally named a hero of the Soviet Union, the very honor that had been denied to him in life. He had died years before that recognition came, at the age of only 50, of cancer, having lived and died a disgraced man for carrying out the deadliest attack in the history of war at sea. There is no clean or comfortable moral to be drawn from his life, only the strange, cold truth that the greatest kill the ocean has ever recorded brought its author not triumph, but ruin. There is a bleak symmetry in his fate and the ship's. The Wilhelm Gustloff was built to be celebrated and ended forgotten. Marinesko carried out the single most destructive act of the entire war at sea and ended it disgraced, drinking, and cast out, honored at last only decades later, when almost everyone who could remember was already gone. Neither the ship nor the man was allowed the ending that their scale seemed to demand. Both were too large and too awkward, and too tangled up with things the world would rather not examine, and so both were quietly put away, the ship on the seabed and the man in obscurity, and left there for a very long time. On the German side, there was no reckoning of any kind. All 4 of the ship's captains survived the sinking, every one of them. An official inquiry was opened afterward, but only against Zahn, the submarine officer, and it never reached any conclusion at all, because the country that had convened it collapsed into total ruin within a few months. No one was ever formally held to account for the chain of decisions that had made the ship a target, the choice of deep water over shallow, the slow and straight and predictable course, the navigation lights left burning in the dark. The men who had made those choices lived, and the state that might have judged them ceased to exist, and so the whole question of blame simply dissolved into the wreckage of a falling Reich, unanswered and unowned. And then there is the hardest question of all, the one this story cannot honestly avoid, of whether the sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff was a crime. It deserves to be weighed fairly, and from both sides. Those who have called it a war crime point to the obvious and terrible fact that the ship was crammed with refugees and children, and that to fire upon such a vessel is a moral horror, whatever the letter of the law may say. But the settled judgment of most historians runs the other way, and it runs on cold and solid ground. The Wilhelm Gustloff was painted as a warship, not marked as a hospital ship. She was armed with anti-aircraft guns on her decks. She carried around 1,000 naval personnel, submarine trainees bound for the war beneath the sea, and she was moving them through an active war zone. By the laws of war as they stood, she was a legitimate military target, and Marinesko, peering through his sight at a large, blacked-in enemy ship that had been lit up by her own carelessness, could not possibly have known what she truly held within her. The novelist Günter Grass, who did more than anyone alive to carry this story back into the light, put the matter as plainly as it can be put. He said that the tragedy was not a war crime. It was terrible, he said, but it was a result of war, a terrible result of war, a lawful act and an almost unbearable human cost, and no court left on earth to hold either the one or the other, which leaves, in the end, only the sea, and the wreck upon its floor, and the few who chose to remember. She lies today in barely 44 meters of water, a ship longer than the depth that hides her, marked on the charts as nothing but a wreck, off the coast of what is now Poland, in the cold and the perpetual dark of the Baltic floor. The Wilhelm Gustloff rests where she fell, broken and silent, one of the largest wrecks in that whole grey sea. On the nautical charts, she carries no name any longer, only the plain flat word for a wreck, and beneath that ordinary word lie the bones of the greatest loss of life the sea has ever taken from a single ship. The Polish authorities have ringed her with a zone of protection, forbidding divers and anchors and fishing nets within a wide circle drawn around her, because she is not treated as an ordinary wreck to be picked over and plundered, but as what she truly is, a war grave, the last resting place of thousands of people who were never brought home to any shore. She has not been left entirely in peace, even so, because a rumour long held that the fabled Amber Room, the priceless treasure looted by the Germans and then lost in the chaos of the war, might have been hidden somewhere in her holds. She has drawn treasure hunters and divers down to her over the years, picking at a grave in search of gold. It was in part to stop exactly that, and to keep the dead below undisturbed, that the wide zone of exclusion was drawn around her at all. There is something fitting and something terrible in it, that even now a few come to her hoping for treasure, when the only thing she truly holds within her broken hull is the largest gathering of the drowned that the sea has ever made in a single place. For a very long time she was more than merely protected. She was buried under silence. The dead of the Wilhelm Gustloff were Germans, and in the years that followed the war, there was almost no one, inside Germany or anywhere beyond it, who was willing to grieve German dead out loud. The vast scale of what Germany itself had done pressed down on any telling of what ordinary Germans had suffered, and understandably so, and the long freeze of the Cold War drew a hard political line straight through the very sea where she lay. And so the largest maritime disaster in the entire history of the world became a thing that was simply not spoken of, a number left uncounted, a grave that the world chose to step quietly around rather than look into. The very magnitude that ought to have made her unforgettable was the thing that made her convenient to forget. Even the ship's bell, raised at some point from the wreck below, ended up for years as a decoration on the wall of a seafood restaurant, a relic of 9,000 deaths hung up where diners passed beneath it without a second glance. But not quite everyone stepped around her. Return, at the very last, to the young purser who had come up out of that freezing water alive. Heinz Schön could not forget, and he made a quiet and stubborn decision that he would not allow the world to forget either. Across the long decades of his life, he gathered the scattered accounts of the survivors, reconstructed the impossible boarding, argued over every figure with anyone who would engage him, and set down again and again the number he believed in his bones to be the truth, that some 9,300 people had died on the night of the 30th of January 1945. For many years, he was very nearly the only voice on Earth insisting that the number be spoken aloud at all. Where a whole state had collapsed and a whole world had turned its face away, one surviving crewman sat alone with the terrible arithmetic of the dead and refused to let it disappear into the silence. And in the end, it was his patient counting, and much later a great novel that drew upon his life's work that carried the name of the Wilhelm Gustloff back up out of the dark and into the light where it has always belonged. And so, the ship without classes came at last to her rest. She had been built to prove that the difference between the high and the low could be abolished by an act of political will. And in the freezing dark of her final hour, the sea made that hollow boast true in the only way it ever truly could. The Baltic did not pause to ask who among its thousands was a party official and who was a fleeing refugee child, who had helped to build the horror and who had merely run before it. It took them all into the same black water, in the same handful of minutes, without any distinction at all. And so the promise of the ship without classes was kept, at the very end, by the cold indifference of the sea. That is the deepest and the coldest truth she leaves behind her, that the sheer scale of a death has nothing whatever to do with whether the world will choose to mourn it, and that a disaster is remembered only when some living person decides to do the remembering. 9,000 people, most of them children, went down 30 miles from land on a night when the world was too busy, or too ashamed, or too weary to look. Gunter Grass, reaching in the end for why it had taken 2 whole generations even to say their names, warned that a thing left unspoken does not thereby cease to exist and does not go away. The Wilhelm Gustloff did not go away. She lies still in 44 meters of cold Baltic water with her thousands around her, waiting, as she has waited since that night, for a world at last willing to say how many she carried, and to remember that every single one of them was as real as you are. If this story stayed with you, subscribe, because there is always another great ship and another final night waiting to be told, and every one of them deserves to be remembered too. And tell me honestly, before tonight, had you ever once heard the name Wilhelm Gustloff, the deadliest sinking in the history of the sea? Say where you are watching from, and I will read every reply.